Putin declines to extend the Easter ceasefire in Ukraine. The Lebanese president monitors escalating Israeli strikes in the south. And the United Nations urges Syria to begin economic recovery. Russia's President Vladimir Putin has not issued an order to extend the Easter ceasefire in Ukraine. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov comments come as the ceasefire is set to expire at 21 GMT today. Earlier, Putin announced a surprise one-day ceasefire in Ukraine for Easter, but Kiev said Russian forces continued artillery fire and called instead for an extended true halt to hostilities. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has said that the Russian army is making a pretense of an Easter ceasefire. Zelensky said in a post on social media, as of Easter morning, the Russian army appears to be trying to give the general impression of a ceasefire, though in some areas it continues to make it isolated attempts to advance and inflict losses on Ukraine. Putin, hours before heading to an Orthodox Easter service, announced the surprise one-day ceasefire, ordering his forces to stop all military activity along the front line in the three-year-old war. Air raid sirens rang out in Kiev after Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a surprise one-day ceasefire in Ukraine for Easter. The air raid alert was cleared in 15 minutes without any attacks reported by Kiev authorities. Putin's unilateral move followed Washington's announcement that it could abandon peace talks within days unless Moscow and Kiev showed they were serious about negotiating. Russia and Ukraine have conducted a swap of more than 500 prisoners of war. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, in a post on the Telegram messaging app, said 277 Ukrainian service personnel had returned home from Russian captivity. Russia's defense ministry said 246 servicemen had been handed over by Kiev. It said a further 31 injured prisoners of war had been handed over to Ukraine, and 15 of its own wounded servicemen had also been returned by Kiev. Zelensky said a total of 4,552 Ukrainians, service personnel and civilians, have been returned since the start of the war. And now we move on to the latest updates in Lebanon.
كل المستهدفين هن مدنيين. وضع شيء مرعب، شيء بخوف.
Lebanon's health ministry has confirmed that at least 4 have been killed in the Israeli drone strike in Kawthariyat al-Siyad. The health ministry said in a statement the strike targeted a vehicle located inland between the southern cities of Sidon and Tyre. That comes as Israel continues to conduct regular strikes in Lebanon despite the November 27th ceasefire that sought to halt more than a year of hostilities, including 2 months of all-out war between Israel and Hezbollah. Lebanese presidency has announced that Lebanon's President Joseph Aoun is closely monitoring the escalating Israeli attacks on southern villages. They added that Aoun has maintained continuous communication with the army commander, receiving detailed reports on the situation. Aoun has also instructed the acting army commander to conduct on-ground assessments in South Lebanon amid heightened tensions along the border. And the border village of Ramesh in southern Lebanon celebrated Easter Sunday with traditional festivities despite heightened tensions along the Israeli-Lebanese border. Residents gathered in the courtyard of the local church, sharing sweets and exchanging Easter greetings in a show of resilience. This year's Holy Week observances come in the wake of a ceasefire declared in November, which brought a temporary pause to more than a year of hostilities between Israel and Hezbollah. While the truce has offered some relief, Israel's strikes have continued in parts of southern Lebanon, keeping tensions high.
يلا تنعاد عليكم. طبيعة الإنسان إنه يعيش ضميره، شو طبيعة المسيحي؟ وإن كان المسيح لم يقم فباطل إيمانكم.
And now we move on to the latest updates in Syria. A visiting UN official has said that Syria's authorities should begin the process of economic recovery without waiting for Western sanctions. Regional Chief for Arab States at the United Nations Development Programme, Abdallah El-Dardiri, said sanctions are a challenge that must be addressed. However, at the same time, Syria must begin the process of economic recovery. Dardari said this process should include projects directly affecting citizens, the provision of services by civil society, particularly in education, and the rapid improvement of public services. And Christians in Damascus have celebrated Easter as security measures were seen spread around churches in the city by both security forces and local protection committees formed in the neighborhoods. This year marked the first time Christians in Syria celebrated Easter following the ousting of Bashar al-Assad. And for the approximately 100,000 Christians who remain in the country, just 2% of the pre-war population of 1.5 million, it was the first major Christian celebration under the new government headed by President Ahmed al-Shara. And Houthis have said U.S. forces carried out at least 29 attacks across Yemen yesterday, killing at least 3 people in the capital. Beyond Sanaa, the Houthis said the U.S. airstrikes also hit Yemen's Ma'rib and Amran provinces. Earlier this week, the group said that U.S. strikes on the fuel port of Ras Isa killed at least 80 people and wounded 150 in the deadliest attack of Washington's 15-month campaign against the Houthis. The U.S. military has hammered the Yemeni Houthis with the near-daily airstrikes for the past month in a bid to stamp out their attacks on shipping in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden. And for more analysis, we now move to Rihem Morsi in our newsroom. Hello, Rihem.
Hello, Salma. Thank you. Back to the situation in southern Lebanon. We're joined from Beirut by the military and strategic expert Brigadier General Adel al-Mashmoushi. Thank you, sir, for joining us here on Qnews. Sir, let's start off by asking, what does Israel aim to achieve with its continued drone strikes despite the November ceasefire?
Good evening. Greetings to you and your esteemed audience. In fact, Lebanon is living in a very delicate time. Despite the Israeli enemy continued airstrikes as exceeded the borders between Lithuania and the Palestinian borders and exceeded and hit an area ranged about 35 kilometers of the border, and it seems that the Israeli enemy responded to some actions by Hezbollah and stands as the Hezbollah's leader announced that there is no intention to hand over their arms. So the Lebanese state is standing between two difficult stations and stances.
So, sir, what kind of legal or diplomatic channels does Lebanon have to respond to these violations of the ceasefire agreement? Because this isn't the first time that the Israelis have violated the ceasefire agreement. Okay, it seems that we've lost contact there with the Brigadier General, so we head back to Salma in our studio. That was Brigadier General Adel al-Mashmoushi. Thank you so much, and back to you, Salma.
Thank you, Rihem. And the Sudanese army has announced that 7 people were killed and 3 others were injured after the support forces shelled neighborhoods in the city of El-Fasher, located in North Darfur state. The army announced that its forces, along with supporting units, conducted routine sweeps, seizing various weapons, ammunition, and spare parts, and arresting individuals attempting to infiltrate. The army also emphasized that the people of El-Fasher thwarted the support forces' plans by refusing to leave the city despite false calls that harbor intentions of violence. And now we move on to the latest updates in Gaza. The Israeli occupation military has released details from their review of the killing of 15 emergency workers in Gaza last month. The occupation military said there had been several professional failures, breaches of orders, and a failure to fully report the incident. The 15 paramedics and emergency responders shot dead on March the 23rd and buried in a shallow grave where their bodies were found a week later by officials from the United Nations and the Palestinian Red Crescent. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has directed the military to intensify operations against Hamas, saying the fight must continue until what he described as victory is achieved. His remarks follow Hamas's rejection of the latest Israeli proposal for a temporary ceasefire. Hamas instead reiterated its demand for a comprehensive agreement that would end the war in exchange for the release of detainees. The developments come as the conflict enters a new phase, with diplomatic efforts facing renewed setbacks. Hamas has announced that the fate of the Israeli-American detainee Idan Alexander remains unknown after one of the guards assigned to him was found dead. President Donald Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff told reporters at the White House in March that gaining the release of Alexander, believed to be the last living American detainee held by Hamas in Gaza, was a top priority. The release of Alexander was at the center of talks held between Hamas leaders and U.S. detainee negotiator Adam Boehler last month. Hamas released 58 detainees under a brief ceasefire that began on January the 19th. At least 12 Palestinians have been killed and several others wounded in a series of Israeli airstrikes across the Gaza Strip, targeting Gaza City, Khan Yunis, and Rafah. In Gaza City, 5 people were killed when Israeli warplanes struck El Nakhil Street in the El Tufa neighborhood. In southern Gaza, 2 civilians identified as Ismail Lakad and his son Ahmed were killed when their family home was hit in the El Manara neighborhood of Khan Yunis. A separate strike on the Kafsova area east of Rafah claimed the lives of 5 more people. Efforts to recover bodies from the rubble remain difficult as civil defense teams face intense shelling and widespread destruction. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, the UNRWA, has announced that it is currently operating 115 shelter centers across the Gaza Strip, hosting more than 90,000 displaced Palestinians. In a statement posted on X, UNRWA warned that the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Gaza continues to worsen amid ongoing Israeli bombardments and blockade that are preventing the entry of humanitarian aid and commercial supplies. The United Nations estimates that approximately 420,000 people have been newly displaced since the collapse of the ceasefire on March the 18th, further straining already overwhelmed humanitarian services. The UN World Food Programme has warned of a worsening crisis in Gaza, where nearly 2 million displaced people rely entirely on aid for basic food needs. The WFP raised alarm over an increasing danger to hundreds of thousands of Gaza's population. The program expressed grave concern over the sharp decline in food stocks, warning that the region is on the brink of a potential humanitarian catastrophe. The WFP emphasized that this critical situation is compounded by Israel's ongoing closure of the border crossings, which is preventing the delivery of vital food supplies to the besieged enclave. The United Nations Children's Fund UNICEF has warned that hospitals treating children and newborns in the Gaza Strip are operating under extremely dire conditions and lack essential medical equipment. In a post on its X account, UNICEF stated that the survival of children in Gaza now depends on a ceasefire, urgent delivery of humanitarian aid into the besieged territory. The appeal comes as part of growing international concern over the worsening humanitarian crisis in Gaza, where ongoing Israeli airstrikes and siege have devastated infrastructure, displaced the majority of the population, and crippled the healthcare system. And dozens of protesters have clashed with police in a central Israeli community where Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was expected to visit. Demonstrators voiced their anger at his vow to continue the war with Hamas, demanding an end to the war and the release of the remaining 59 detainees held in Gaza. Tensions flared as protesters pushed against police barricades, with some attempting to breach a makeshift gate. The demonstrators carried signs and chanted slogans accusing Netanyahu of prolonging a war they believe has achieved nothing but destruction. Britain has said 2 of its fighter jets had intercepted Russian aircraft over the Baltic Sea close to NATO alliance airspace in separate incidents on Tuesday and Thursday. Britain's Ministry of Defence said in a statement the Typhoon fighters were scrambled to intercept a Russian Ilyushin Il-20M Kut intelligence aircraft on Tuesday. The defense added 2 days later, 2 Typhoons intercepted an unknown aircraft leaving Kaliningrad airspace. Bitcoin and crypto prices are treading water after U.S. President Donald Trump's trade war sparked market chaos that threatening to spiral into a full-blown U.S. dollar confidence crisis. The Bitcoin price has plummeted from its January peak of almost $110,000 per Bitcoin, dropping along with the stock market as crypto hurtles towards a $19 trillion tipping point. The White House has confirmed Trump is exploring whether he can fire Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, something that could trigger an apocalyptic scenario as labeled by economists for markets. The French Finance Minister Éric Lombard has stated that the dismissal of U.S. Chairman Powell would further undermine the trust in the dollar, causing bond market instability. Lombard warned of the possibility of increased borrowing costs and serious disruption to the U.S. economy if Chairman Powell is dismissed. The remarks were made shortly after President Trump mentioned the possibility of dismissing Chairman Powell.
Donc il est très important que les négociations se mettent en place rapidement entre les autorités américaines et la Commission européenne afin d'arriver à une baisse de ces droits.
And residents in India have said that they were hopeful of improved trade relations with the United States as Vice President J.D. Vance is set to make his first state visit to the country since being elected to the office. Vance's visit to India has come amid U.S. President Donald Trump's newly imposed tariffs on Indian imports. India and the United States agreed in February to work on the first phase of a trade deal to be concluded late this year with a view to reaching two-way trade worth $500 billion by 2030. The U.S. is also India's largest trading partner, with bilateral trade valued at $190 billion until recently. And that brings us to the end of our news bulletin, and here is what we've been covering. Putin declines to extend the Easter ceasefire in Ukraine. The Lebanese president monitors escalating Israeli strikes in the south. And the United Nations urges Syria to begin economic recovery. This concludes our news bulletin for the hour, and don't forget to follow Qnews on YouTube, Facebook, X, Instagram, and TikTok at QNewsEG to stay informed. And thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more updates on Qnews.